Proposals made in the budget tell us that employment and skilling of youth have taken mindspace front and center for the government. An amount of rupees 2 lakh crore has been allocated for these initiatives to roll out over a period of 5 years. What do these mean for companies and youth aspiring for their first job? Hello and welcome back to Business Matters with me, K. Bharat Kumar. I'm sorry that we had to take an unannounced break, but we hope to be regular with the series going forward. 3 of the 5 schemes that we just now referred to are focused on job creation, and 2 are directed towards skilling, internships, and upgrading educational infrastructure. Questions around these initiatives have begun surfacing coming from various quarters. For example, one question is this enough for a country of our size? And is this enough to prod a company to employ more? Or why couldn't the government have started off at the primary school level and worked upwards? Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's hear what Dr. Amit Baswale, Professor of Economics at Azim Premji University, has to say about the spirit behind these announcements.
Bringing together, calling it the employment-linked incentive, obviously to invoke parallels with the production-linked incentive schemes, the internship stuff that maybe we can talk about also. So there's an employment focus to the budget that seems significant from a signaling point of view.
Scheme A is meant for employees who enter the organized workforce for the first time, recognized by their participation in the Employee Provident Fund Organization or the EPFO. They will be given rupees 15,000 in 3 installments. Eligibility limit is 1 lakh rupees salary per month. This, the government says, is expected to benefit 2.1 crore individuals. Now, the question that crops up here is, how does this scheme benefit employers? This is, after all, a direct payment made to employees. How does this nudge job creation, new job creation? This query was posed to Dr. T.V. Somanathan, Finance Secretary, Government of India, and one of the architects of the budget at an event organized by a sister publication, Business Line. His response was that this was an amount that no doubt went directly to the employee, but when the employer knows that such a prospective employee would be getting such an amount, the salary would be negotiated accordingly. He said the government wanted to ensure that the amount directly reached the employee while also nudging the employer to rope in freshers or first-time employees. The second scheme is meant to help add first-time employees specifically in the manufacturing sector. The government says an incentive will be provided at a specified scale directly both to the employee and the employer with respect to their EPFO contribution in the first 4 years of employment. The scheme, the government says, is expected to benefit 30 lakh youth entering employment and their employers. Dr. Somanathan says that all these schemes are tied to the employee being enrolled or registered under the EPFO. He says that the government would like to bring in as many as possible under the EPFO ambit. According to him, the EPFO is a form of social security and that's important for everyone, and that the government would not like to see anybody outside this umbrella. The third scheme is employer focused and will cover additional employment in all sectors. All additional employment within a salary of rupees 1 lakh per month will be counted. The government, it says, will reimburse employers up to rupees 3,000 per month for 2 years towards their EPFO contribution for each additional employee. The scheme is expected to incentivize additional employment of 50 lakh persons. Now, can these government schemes actually make companies employ even if they had no plans to add to their headcount? Clearly not. Dr. Somanathan says that the existence of a subsidy, for example, in the case of research and development, R&D, if there is an R&D subsidy, companies that are already doing R&D work would like to increase or expand their work and add to their headcount a little bit because of a subsidy that exists. Likewise, if anyway companies are adding to their headcount, they may add more because of the subsidy. The rationale behind these schemes seems to be that the cost of training a fresher or a first-time employee is not something that companies are keen to take on. Dr. Somanathan says that prior experience for a candidate seems to lend a lot of weight to their resume, whereas a fresher is not always so welcome. So if the government can take away some of the cost of training a fresher, companies may be more inclined to considering first-time employees. The fourth scheme is about upgradation of ITIs, and the final one, the fifth, will help enable internship opportunities in 500 top companies to 1 crore youth over 5 years. The government says that it hopes they will gain exposure for 12 months to real-life business environments, varied professions, and employment opportunities. An internship allowance of rupees 5,000 per month along with a one-time assistance of rupees 6,000 will be provided. Companies, though, are expected to bear the cost of training and 10% of the internship cost from their CSR funds, CSR standing for Corporate Social Responsibility. Now we come back to a question, the one question that we put out at the beginning of this episode: shouldn't the government have started off at the grassroots level? For example, we often see reports time after time indicating that 8th standard students, for example, are unable to solve math problems at the 5th standard level, or that they don't possess the language skills that they ought to at that level. Let's see what Professor Amit Basole, whom we saw at the beginning of this episode, has to say on this issue.
Fact is that one can't wait for anything per se, because there are different problems at different stages, if you will, right? So if you imagine the worker's life cycle, then there's the question of primary schooling or general education. There's the question of vocational or professional training, and then there's the question of transitioning from finishing your education to getting a job. These are all important milestones, and they have different challenges associated with each stage, and many of those are well understood. I think what this particular collection of policies, including that internship type of policy, is trying to address is that last question of you finished whatever training it is, and you can't get that start in the workforce. So we are going to try to make it a little easier for first-time entrants to find jobs. This seems to be the thinking, whether by giving them some real experience through internships or by making the cost of hiring cheaper for first-time workers or employers. And it's a good area to focus on, holding constant whatever training and education has been received. I mean, these people have already finished that. So it's not like you can go back and say, well, get better educated. That's not an option for. So you need to work on this as well. And of course, as you're right, that further up the pipeline, naturally, we do need to think about these serious issues. And there are so many surveys that keep coming up talking about employability. Employers also seem to think that people are not ready when, especially young people, to work. Need whatever skills, soft skills, hard skills, and so on. So all of that needs work, and some of that shows up in the budget. General education stuff, yeah, I mean, we've known for a long time that we need to do this.
Thanks, Professor. That was insightful. Now, what obstacles could come in the way of these initiatives, or worse, what could derail these initiatives by the government?
The Provident Fund system, or broadly speaking, this formal system, is a minor part of the Indian workforce. Right? It's about, I think PF rolls are something like 65 million workers stock. And then, about 500 or 600,000 firms regularly pay into it and so on. But the Indian workforce is, of course, over 600 million people, a lot of them in agriculture and so forth. So what happens in the rest of it matters for the structure of the economy per se. So if I'm creating more formal employment and people are going there, but elsewhere, right, or if the pace of that creation falls behind three things: new people entering the workforce, people leaving the agricultural sector, and people wanting to leave petty trade and retail and those kinds of surplus labor activities or domestic service and wanting jobs. You can even include your gig worker in that, because if they want a proper formal job, then so these are all categories of people who are looking for formal work. And so that's the supply of labor to the formal sector, and then there is intake happening. Now, if that intake is happening, that's good. But if it is smaller than this influx of workers, then of course, on balance, the structure of the economy is not changing in the desirable direction. So you need to create jobs at least equal to these kinds of people coming in, and that's when the structure is going to start moving. And if you see from the PLFS data, the proportion of workers who have regular salaried jobs, which is all PF workers and then some who don't have PF, etc., that proportion hasn't changed a lot since 1718 or 1819. In the last 5 years or so, it's kind of stuck. So that means that on net, we are not creating enough of these kinds of regular salaried opportunities. For that, such schemes, I think, are not the answer, because they are operating on the margin. Right? And that's where we go back to the question of capacity utilization, demand. Firms really, if they are interested in hiring, then they might not look at many of these things, and they'll just start hiring. Right? And that's a very different kind of a labor market than what we have right now.
Interestingly, as the professor says, employment is indirectly linked to consumption demand. So, spending in what are the areas where the government can actually spur new jobs creation?
I'll just say one thing which actually connects back to something that is part of the budget, which is the focus on MSMEs. Right? I mentioned earlier that, what are the kinds of employers for whom this might matter, and smaller employers maybe. And going back to the question of where do broadly jobs come from, we know that uh, large firms, corporate India and so forth, that's not where a lot of the numbers come from. These are either capital intensive firms, or they are just, a small part of the entire equation, even though they may be large per se. Like you may be employing, 10,000 workers, but there are only a few hundred such companies. There are hundreds of thousands of other companies. So money spent on the MSMEs, uh, other things equal, I think probably gives you higher multiplier effects on jobs. And when I say money spent on MSMEs, you can take different ways. The budget talks about deregulation, infrastructure, couple of things at least. And we all know that compliances are an issue. It has been long talked about. And we know that local infrastructure is a big issue. So that brings me to my sort of where would I spend that money question, right? That we've had a few years of solid focus on capital expenditure and infrastructure, highways, airports, ports, and there's no disputing the importance of those things broadly. But we also know that the moment you go off the highway, there's a different world waiting for you, right? And the example I give to my students is compare airports and bus stands, right? Most people are at bus stands, and that's how they're traveling, or railways and so on. So we are not talking about Vande Bharat, we are talking about all the entire rest of the railways. So as long as we are prioritizing the airports and the Vande Bharats, we are not quite there where we'll get the bang for the buck, right? Now, if you start improving local roads, improve the power situation, water situation, make it easier for local businesses to conduct businesses and, get workers moving, public safety for women, many things that we know we need to do at the local level. That's where I think you'll get a lot of bang for your buck. It's harder to spend this money because it goes through state governments, ULBs, and the state budget has a lot of focus on states. To their credit, even the economic survey keeps talking about how many of these things are state level things, and I'm glad that that's part of the discussion. So urban local bodies, state governments, these are where a lot of these constraints actually get addressed. So a way to get that money down there and then ensuring that it is spent is where the action is. And we know that from the experience of China, Vietnam, other countries, that how much money gets spent at the local level really matters. And we haven't done that well. Our expenditure is very top heavy still.
Yes. Many of these schemes seem to aim to take away the cost of training. But what if cost of training is not the primary concern for companies? What if there are other structural issues that still need to be addressed?
We want to go beyond signaling and actually create employment. Now, there is where the question comes: what do we think are the main constraints, on job creation? Right? So if we look at these kinds of schemes, and there is a version of this already out there under the name the Pradhan Mantri Rozgar Protsahan Yojana, which is a few years old now, which also works through the Provident Fund system and essentially subsidizes, by paying a part of the contribution, it subsidizes that aspect of the cost to the employer. So they are all ways of reducing the cost of new employment for employers in a way, right? Most of them play on this variation. Now, that would work if we thought that the main constraint to employers hiring new workers is this cost of either hiring an extra worker or formalizing the worker. Let's say you're not paying PF, or you're working through some other means and now you have to do it. The government is saying, well, we will defray part of the cost for part of the year, and that should sweeten the deal for you somewhat. If we think these are the constraints, and there's an interview in today's Hindu actually with TV Somnathan where he's sort of arguing the same, the interview. He's talking about at the margin, we expect this to happen. And at the margin is a very well used term here because we're talking about that additional hiring. However, if we think that there are some bigger structural reasons why the economy is not able to create the required number of such jobs, and that could include an insufficient demand. There's been a lot of talk about how consumption has grown weakly, how the informal sector is not doing well, and so forth, which links up to inadequate demand in the economy. and connects back to the lack of private investment, which has been the topic of discussion for so long. Um, if these are the issues, then the companies are not constrained by those costs. They are constrained by just capacity not being used enough. And so there's no reason to hire new people. And once that reason comes up, perhaps they won't care about these kinds of costs, right? That's one type of argument. Now, I don't think that that makes it useless at all. I think it just means that we have to think carefully about which are the employers who we think really would uh, care about something like this, whose decision making would actually be influenced. And I think we haven't done the required research to really say that with confidence, but I'll say one thing and then I'll stop. My intuition is that smaller employers would be likely to care more, because by smaller I mean, companies that employ, let's say, 100 workers or 50 workers or 40 workers or whatever. These are small firms, and there are a lot of these, right, in the PF system, etc. as well. They have smaller margins. They're operating on tighter, more competitive kind of environment, and you can imagine that they have less room to maneuver with these kinds of costs. So if I come in and say, okay, you can hire these new people, I'll defray some of these costs, maybe that encourages them to pick up the hiring. Does that continue when the scheme runs out? That's also a question we don't know the answer to. So these are all, I think, things that hopefully research will also answer.
Now, that is the crux or the essence of this issue. It still remains to be seen that when implemented, how these initiatives actually spur new jobs creation. We will watch trends in the space and come back to you if there are any significant developments. Before you go away, here's something that you need to know, or rather, did you know that as per the All India Survey on Higher Education for 2021-22 conducted by the government, just in excess of 1 crore students passed out from various levels such as undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD, MPhil, and other diploma or certificate courses that year. Here's a quiz question for this week. As per the Survey on Higher Education report for 21-22, how many MBBS graduates do you think were there in that year? The answer here gains importance in the context of our total population exceeding 1.4 billion people. That's all we have for you in this episode. Before you go away, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until we meet again, have a lovely week ahead.